Welcome to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast
with Garrett Williamson.
Health, wellness, exercise, nutrition, and a whole lot more. Got questions? Call us and leave a message at 251-278-EDGE or message us at Personal Edge Fitness on Facebook and Instagram, at Team PE on Twitter, or personaledgefitness.com.
As I've said many times, I've been a personal trainer for 29 years. I've worked in 4 different states as a personal trainer, and I run the number 1 facility in the state, one of the top 10 facilities in the Southeast in personal training. So I've got experience, obviously, as a personal trainer. I've also had over 30 trainers working in my facilities. I'll tell you something that maybe some trainers will tell you, maybe they won't, but I've got a little experience with this, so I know for sure. And I've seen this out of every trainer that I've ever had the privilege of working with. And that is, we all have not only favorite machines, but we also have favorite body parts. We naturally gravitate to the body part that we just like working, that we just, whether it's something because of a particular sport that we did or something we identify as, wow, having big biceps is a sign of strength, whatever it is, however we identify with it. Or in certain cases, just kind of take a little pity. Just kind of take a little pity on a muscle or muscle group because of being picked on or being a weak muscle. And I guess that's probably the reason for my affinity to hamstrings. This is Garrett Williamson. You're listening to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast, and we're talking about today your hamstrings and you. Now, I'm dedicating the entire podcast to the area of hamstrings. Why? Well, I think I just mentioned it. It happens to be one of my favorite body parts, my favorite muscle groups. But I know why it is. It's easy for me to pinpoint why I have such an affinity for hamstrings, and that is that it is the most commonly pulled large muscle in the body. Now, you've heard this before, I'm sure. I'm sure you've heard of a scenario similar to this. Gosh, he was doing fantastic in that race. He was in the 100 meters in the Olympics, or she was running the 220, and she was on that last leg, and she was ahead of everybody, and then she pulled every single time. You just said it. It wasn't a calf muscle, wasn't a glute, wasn't a quad. It was a hamstring. And as Paul Harvey used to say, and now you know the rest of the story. That's why I have such an affinity for that muscle, is because the reason it's so commonly pulled and we have so many problems with it is because it's so underworked. And in many ways, understood. I wonder if that's right. I hope it makes sense, at least. Understood. How about that? It's not... We don't understand it as much as we do, say, a quadricep or a glute or what have you. And when we don't typically spend as much time working on it. I remember training when I was first starting to personal train, I actually worked as a trainer and assistant manager at a big, large fitness facility and did some personal training there. But also, observed people working out. And one of the areas when I'd set up a program for somebody and they'd work, and one of the things they would avoid the hamstrings. They wouldn't work them. And so that's the reason that neglect is what typically caused that. I mean, conducting a cursory internet search of hamstrings, you'll no doubt find plenty of references to stretching them. And you'll find plenty of references to pulling hamstrings. And these are extremely common concerns and ones that I'm sure you can relate. Just as common as one of the terms I hear that people say a lot is, I don't like to take medication. Or I'm sure that financial planners hear all the time, I just want a safe investment with about a 10% return. These are common quotes. One of the most common overused things that we hear in fitness is that, I've got tight hamstrings. Like that's unusual. I would say the majority of people that I see have quote unquote tight hamstrings. Now, if you heard my podcast on flexibility, you'll understand the reason why you have a tight muscle is that you have a weak muscle. A tight muscle is a weak muscle. A strong muscle is a flexible muscle. I've said this several times. The third most flexible athlete behind a gymnast and a dancer, believe it or not, is a power lifter. Those guys that lift all that weight, and you'll see them in different competitions, and many of them are actually quite a bit of fat hanging off of them, but they're extremely strong. Well, they also have to be extremely flexible, because the stronger a muscle is, the more flexible it is. And the reason we have tight hamstrings is because we typically don't work them. And the interesting situation of all this, of reading on the internet and seeing internet searches of stretching your hamstrings or internet searches of hamstring injuries, the remedy for both of these is, of course, strengthening them. but you don't see as much about strengthening the hamstrings. That's why I'm so passionate about this particular muscle. And by strengthening it, it will cure probably 3 or 4 of the top 10 reasons why somebody would come to see me. One of the biggest injuries we see and problems that we see, problem areas, is lower back pain. Well, tight hamstrings, weak hamstrings contribute, exacerbate lower back pain. Athletes come to us for quickness, speed. Strong hamstrings has a lot to do with strength and speed. People come to us for balance issues. Well, strong hamstrings have a lot to do with balance. So that's why I'm spending a podcast talking about hamstrings. And paying attention to the simple resolutions of strengthening your hamstrings would make, if nothing else, the 2 other concerns of tight hamstrings or injured hamstrings go away. Well, what is the hamstring? Let's break it down. And you hear it a lot of times, you hear it as plural, hamstrings. And you think they're talking about, well, both legs. Well, actually, what we're talking about, the reason we're talking about it in plural is we're talking about 3 different muscles. And it makes up the hamstring group. First muscle is the semimembranosus. I always have a difficult time with that one. I can do biceps femoris all day long, and I can do sympatendinosus all day long. But semimembranosus, I've always had a problem with. I think it's all the M's in there that gives me trouble. So
all I heard was Garrett Morris and Simba. What's the Lion King got to do with this, Garrett?
Exactly so. But the semimembranosus is the first one. Semitendinosus, second one, and biceps femoris is the third one. Now, I'll tell you where these are located. I don't try to get you too confused, but just you can grab your leg and you actually feel these. So the semimembranosus is the one that starts with an M, that has all the M's in it, is the bottom of the pelvis to the middle of the back of the knee. The semitendinosus that goes from the bottom of the pelvis to the inside back of the knee, and the biceps femoris goes from the bottom of the pelvis to the outside back of the knee. All right, let me show you some more common anatomical points that you'll recognize. Locating these 3 different muscles, the 2 tendons that you feel at the back of your knee that feel like the number 11. Well, the outside of that one, the outside of your knee, that tendon is part of the biceps femoris. That's the bottom part of the biceps femoris. The tendon on the inside of the knee that you feel that makes up the other one for the 11 is for the semitendinosus. And the larger tissue, if you reach down inside your knee there, in the back of your knee, it feels like a thick tendon on the inside of your knee, that's actually the bottom of the semimembranosus. Now, that bore you to tears, but it is 3 muscles. It has 3 different heads, like they call it the triceps. The triceps has 3 different heads and 3 different parts of the 3 different muscles. That's what makes up the triceps. So the hamstring's the same way. And the big belly of it that you see when you're actually stretching, you reach around the back of your leg and run your hand down it, that muscle you feel in the back seems like just one muscle. That's the hamstring. No, actually, that's the bicep femoris. That's one of the parts of the hamstring. So now you know the 3 muscles of the hamstring, and I know you feel much smarter. You know, you major leap in your anatomy studies. Let me tell you about the function of the hamstrings. The hamstrings cross and acts upon 2 different joints, the hip and the knee, which is why keeping strong hamstrings is so important. This deals with knee pain. It also deals with hip pain or hip inflexibility. You actually throw off your hips. And this is known as, I don't want to get you too bored with some of this vocabulary, is biarticular muscles, and those are muscles that act upon 2 joints. The 2 semis, the semitendinosus and the semimembranosus, extend the hip when the trunk is fixed. So they actually think about it like kicking your leg backwards, keeping your leg straight and kicking it backwards. That's going to extend the hip. When your upper body's still and it's doing like kickbacks, like especially with the leg straight, that's what your semitendinosus and semimembranosus do. They also flex the knee and inwardly rotate the lower leg when the knee is bent. Now, the long head of the biceps femoris, that's the one that you feel, the belly of that thing you feel when you reach on the back of your leg. It extends the hip as when you're like beginning to walk. It doesn't extend the knee, but it extends the hip. Both short and long heads flex the knee and laterally or outwardly rotate the lower leg when the knee is bent. So that's what your hamstring actually does. And think about it. It's also big time trying to bring your heel to your rear end. That's your hamstring. Your hamstring controls that motion, which is why we know of it as leg curls that we can do to actually strengthen the hamstrings. And that's one of the most common exercises that people do with a leg curl, but there's actually some that are as important, if not more important, than doing leg curls. We'll get to that in a second. The hamstrings play a crucial role in many of your daily activities, such as walking, running, jumping, and controlling some movements in the rear end. They actually help control some of those movements. In walking, they are most important as an antagonist to the quadriceps in the deceleration of knee extension. All right, what do I mean by that? Okay, every muscle has an equal and opposite muscle. Your biceps have triceps. Your quadriceps have hamstrings. You've got opposing muscles in your core. In your stomach, you've got abdominal muscles, and you've got back muscles, rector spinae, and what have you, that actually oppose it. So that I said a minute ago that it opposes as the antagonist to the quadricep by decelerating the knee extension. Okay, your quadricep kicks your leg out. If you're going to kick a football or kick a kickball and you bend your knee backwards and you swing, when you swing that knee forward, swing that leg forward from the knee, that's your quadricep. If you didn't have a hamstring, your leg would keep on going until it flipped right off your knee and broke. Your hamstring actually holds it in place so it doesn't go any further. It goes to that straight position and stops there. And you can see why, if your hamstring's weak and you kick hard, real easy to pull it, which is why a lot of people pull hamstrings, because they don't maintain the strength in them. Think about also walking uphill. Now, you do this when you're running, but I like to tell people to think about walking uphill, because when you're walking uphill, you can think of the concept of digging your heel into the hill and pulling yourself forward. You're having to lean, but you're also having to grab the ground with your foot and pull yourself forward because you're walking against an incline. That pulling motion, both not only curling that knee, but pulling that leg backwards, that's what your hamstring does. They also contribute to your ability to absorb the shock of movements involving high velocity or force. Like when you're jumping down off of something, your hamstrings can help absorb that shock. So they're very, very, very important muscle. But one of the biggest reasons why it's so important is because of those two joints that it's connected to and its position in the body. As I said earlier, you can have knee pain. I had a client that would get on elliptical and go on elliptical for a long time, and pretty soon would start developing pain in the outside of his knee. It was actually right on the outside of his knee, but we traced it towards kind of the back of the knee, and we realized that it was one of the hamstring muscles that was weak that was causing that pain. You noticed it on the elliptical. So he was getting knee pain because of weak hamstrings. And if your hamstrings stay weak and it keeps pulling the knee the wrong way, you can end up with knee damage. You can end up with ACL tears. You can end up with medial meniscus problems because you're pulling the knee in the wrong direction, then one wrong step, one wrong move, one wrong twist, and you're not able to compensate quickly enough with that hamstring, and boom, the pressure goes right into the joint. Whenever you weaken a muscle, then the shock and the pressure goes into either the joint or the bones, which is why we try to keep our hip strength in order to protect our pelvis. It's why you strengthen any muscle is mainly you're looking to protect that bone, that joint. And the fact that the hamstring connects to the knee and the hips, and the pelvis, which is where the hip pain is, you can see where that can cause a lot of problems. This is something I used early on in my practice. I still use it to this day. But to show people, to really show the difference and why the hamstrings are so important, I have the best luck with people that have any sort of lower back pain. And if you have lower back pain, and usually in that situation, in the morning I get up and it's tight, but after I get moving, it's pretty good. But if I sit down for a long time, or if I'm riding in a car for a long time and I get up, my back hurts. Well, what's happening there? Think about it. You get up in the morning and it's hurting. But once you start moving around, it feels better. Let's take that. When you get up in the morning, you have very little circulation. And your heart rate's been low. You've been sleeping. Therefore, the capillaries and the blood vessels are small. They're not pumping a lot of that warm blood going around the body. So that's one thing. Your muscles are literally cold. If they're cold, they're going to draw into themselves. They're going to tighten up. That makes sense to you, I'm sure. But they're going to constrict. Well, your hamstrings connect to the bottom part of your pelvis. Your pelvis will rotate. It'll do like pelvic tilts. It'll rotate. When it rotates and pulls down, look where it's pulling. It's going to pull on your lower back. It's going to pull on all the tissue that's connected to your lower back. And so as your pelvis pulls down, because your hamstrings are cold and they're tight, it's going to cause pain. That's why when you get up in the morning, my back hurts. But as I get moving, it gets better. As they get the circulation going, as those hamstrings warm up and loosen up, then they stop pulling on your back, exacerbating, not causing, but exacerbating any kind of pain or any kind of weakness that you may have there. Riding in a car, same situation. You're sitting in a position where you've collapsed your hamstring, you've lowered your heart rate, therefore you've lowered the circulation, you've made that muscle go cold again, and therefore get tight, and therefore you end up with that back pain again. So the reason I say that I've been able to convince people of the need to work with hamstrings, the ones that have back pain, I can convince them a lot faster, and I have more luck with that, is because I can take somebody like that, put them on one of our mat tables. Now, we stretch every client at the end of every single session. We actually manually stretch every client, hands-on stretching. All of my staff is trained in several different modes of stretching, one of which happens to be PNF stretching, which is actually a facilitated type of stretching, which goes a little deeper into the muscle. And we do PNF stretching with the client. We lay them down on the table and we stretch their hamstring. That's all we do. Don't even worry about stretching hips or anything. Just stretch the hamstrings when I'm trying to show them where the pain is coming from, where it's being exacerbated. And as soon as they stand up, get off that table, they can't believe how good they feel. Immediate relief. So there's a tip for you. Back's bothering you at all? Place your foot up on something like a curb even. If you can pull it up high enough, put it up on a chair and lean forward slightly. Lean forward slightly with a straight leg, and you're going to stretch that hamstring. I guarantee you, your pain may not go away, but it will definitely lessen. It only works every single time. So a little tip I like to use for that. But that's why your maintaining hamstring strength is so important. Because tight hamstrings not only affect the lower back, weak glutes can actually cause hamstrings to be tight and cause or exacerbate pain in the lower back too. But knee problems and hip problems, lower back problems, I think that's enough of a reason to stretch this one muscle group and strengthen this one muscle group. And I'll tell you, it's very easy to train. It's a simple muscle to train. Training the hamstrings, we have a few different ways to go about it. First thing that's mentioned, the one that's most popular that most people know, and that's leg curls. Now, you have leg curl machines. You have prone leg curl machines. Those are the ones you're laying face down. And your legs are on the machine, on the mat part of the machine, and your knees are bent up. Usually there's a bar across the back of your Achilles. And you're curling that bar towards your rear end. Or if you have an upright machine, which happens to be my most favorite machine in my facility, is my upright leg curl. Then you're going to be sitting up. You're going to have your legs out in front of you, sitting on top of a pad that moves, a swing arm that moves. And usually that pad is associated right around just below the calf, just not quite on top of the Achilles, but right in that area. And you're going to curl that back towards your rear end. And that's a fantastic way to work the hamstrings through a leg curl. But one that's as good, if not better, is what's called a hamstring extension. Now, there's several different exercises that do hamstring extensions. There's good mornings, there's RDLs, there's deadlifts, even squats do somewhat of a hamstring extension. And the way to replicate this and understand how this muscle works or how this exercise works and what's going on with this muscle, and listen very carefully about how to do this. Because you're going to think you're going to hurt your back, but you can actually keep your back protected as long as there's not any pre-existing back trouble. When you're standing upright, arch your back. In other words, stick your chest up. Bring your chin up. Look up slightly. Now you're going to hold your chest and your head in that position, keeping that back arched. You're going to bend your knees slightly, and you're actually going to dip over, bend from the waist. Now you're still looking, you're bringing your head back. So by now, if you're bending over, you should be looking straight forward in front of you, not looking at the ground, and keeping your back arched. By doing that, you're locking that lower back into position. You're not going to put any stress on that lower back because that stress is now going to get referred to the hamstrings. And it's going to feel like a hamstring stretch, but what you're actually doing is you're firing that muscle. You're contracting it. And by contracting that muscle, firing that muscle, you're working it. And that's a simple good morning. It's also the move we use in an RDL. It's also one of the beginning moves of a deadlift, depending on if you're doing a straight leg deadlift, bent knee deadlift, what have you. Hamstrings are big movers in those. And those functional type movements are tremendous for the hamstring, especially when it comes to hamstring extensions. I'm a huge fan of those. But no matter if you're trying to get faster, trying to get stronger, trying to take care of back pain, knee pain, maintaining those hamstrings, I mean, they're paramount. They are paramount. They will give you an incredible advantage, I promise you. If you're interested in stretching your hamstrings, now if you notice in this whole hamstring talk, I've waited to the end to talk about stretching. And the reason being is that that's commonly covered. You know, stretch your hamstrings, stretch your hamstrings, stretch your hamstrings. Well, that's important. It's extremely important. I have a background in gymnastics. I'm a big fan of flexibility. But stretching is only a temporary fix if you've got a pain in your hamstring or your lower back. Stretching it over time while strengthening it, and you're going to make it flexible. Tight hamstrings are not in your DNA. They're not genetic. We produce those. We produce those by producing weak hamstrings. And so stretching is important. It's important to increase the range of motion. It's important to relieve temporary pain. But stretching it a few times a day is not going to make it flexible as much as strengthening it will make it flexible. But after you've worked it, one of the best ways, the simplest ways to stretch the hamstring is actually by using the lower back. Now, it's not what I advise, but I do it from time to time, especially once you're warmed up, and we always stretch at the end of the workout because we want to stretch after the muscles are warm to increase range of motion. But a simple straddle of the legs while standing and bending over to one side will stretch the hamstring. Bending over and grabbing one leg will stretch the hamstring. Going over the other side the same way. But you're using your lower back in that exercise. I highly recommend lying down on a table, lying down on the floor, on a mat table, on the bed, and bringing your leg up by itself. Don't pull it with your hands. Bring your leg up by itself, straight. Bring it up in the air. You'll feel a pull in your hamstring just by doing that. You want to elongate that stretch a little bit, reach behind the knee, pull it in towards you. Now you're stretching the hamstring, but you're not engaging that lower back. You're not using a smaller muscle to stretch a big muscle, therefore risking a pull. And whenever you're doing any kind of stretching on the hamstring, I highly recommend dynamic stretching. We have some great dynamic stretching teachers. We have some videos of some great dynamic stretching. If you're interested in those, contact me at garrett@personaledgefitness.com. I'll make sure we get you set up so you can get those. But dynamic stretching is a movement type stretching. It's fantastic. And I'm a big fan of static stretching. That's the stretching I was telling you about a minute ago that we actually do with our clients, where we actually manually stretch them backwards. But we're not bouncing, we're not pushing, we're not pulsing when we're doing that. We may be doing PNF where they're pushing back against us and then they relax and we push against them, but it's constant. The thing I don't recommend, and I know there's been some news that came out about 10 or 15 years ago about making an argument for ballistic stretching. Dynamic stretching, I think, is what they're after, not ballistic stretching. I'm not a huge fan of doing explosive stretching. I mean, that just sounds like it's dangerous. But I'm not a fan of it. And it's not that it can't be done correctly. It can, but the risk is not worth the reward, especially when you have dynamic stretching and you have static stretching at your disposal. If you have any pain in the lower back, again, I recommend not doing the bend over or stretch your hamstring because you're actually using your lower back to pull on that hamstring. And that lower back, that erector spinae, the quadratus lumborum, they're so much smaller than that hamstring. That's like trying to pull a Terex Titan type truck with a Prius. I mean, you're pretty well going to tear up that Prius, and that Terex isn't going anywhere. So if you have any back problems, I would recommend lying down on the floor and pulling your leg up that way and stretching that hamstring. And of course, one of the best ways to stretch it is the PNF type stretching I was telling you about earlier. If you're interested in that, we do offer assist stretching. That is one-on-one, just stretching. We have one of our certified and degree trainers actually take you through a stretching program on a mat table, stretching whatever you need to work. And hamstrings, I don't think we have a single assist stretch client that we don't stretch their hamstrings. Now, I spent a whole podcast, I know, on this body part, but take it as that's how important this body part is and how highly neglected it is. But I promise you, you take care of your hamstrings and they will take care of you and help lead you to your own level of wellness.
Thanks for listening to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast with Garrett Williamson. Subscribe now and be a part of the show by calling 251-278-EDGE or message us on Facebook and Instagram at Personal Edge Fitness or at Team PE on Twitter, and visit us at personaledgefitness.com.